Let us now address the empirical classification of active galactic nuclei based on their observed properties. In the case you're wondering, the background image here are Darwin's finches. So we can classify active nuclei according to their emission. First of all, whether or not they're radio loud. This was how first quasars were discovered. Within the radio loud category, they come in two varieties, as so-called Fanaroff-Riley types 1 and 2, which I'll define in a bit. And many of the radio quiet ones are not really radio silent. They're just not as radio loud as those that we call radio loud. Now, according to the optical spectrum, we can divide them by whether or not they show broad emission lines. They always do show narrow emission lines. And those that have broad emission lines are called type 1, whereas those that are called with narrow emission lines are called type 2. Thus, we talk about Seyfert galaxies of type 1 or type 2, and also quasars of type 1 and type 2. Luminosity is an obvious physical property to look at, and there we can follow from the lower luminosity objects such as Seyfert galaxies to the higher ones like quasars. There are also special subtypes. For example, there are so-called blazars or BLX, which are radio loud quasars where we're looking right down the relativistic jet, and that causes strong variability. So these classification schemes are all very empirical and largely parallel, and they do reflect some of the intrinsic physical characteristics of these sources, but not necessarily always, and some depend on the orientation from which we're looking at. Seyferts first. They're essentially low luminosity equivalent of quasars, and they've been noted over 100 years ago as luminous nuclei of some nearby galaxies, and even had spectra that nobody understood at the time. This was largely neglected until 1940s, where Carl Seyfert, after whom these galaxies are now named, really did the first systematic study. But even then, it wasn't clear what is going on. And somehow, that was neglected by the time quasars came on the scene. And even though quasar spectra look like Seyfert galaxy spectra, only more so, somehow that connection was not made at first. Here are a couple of pictures of Seyfert galaxies seen face on. They tend to be spiral galaxies, and they have a very luminous, bright nucleus, which even saturates, look like a really bright star smack in the middle of a spiral galaxy. Nearby, maybe 10% of early type spirals contain these nuclei, a smaller fraction for the later type spirals. They tend not to have much in terms of radio emission, but they can have some, and they also have moderate extra emission, just like more luminous quasars do. Quasars themselves outshine their host galaxies by a great factor, maybe by a factor of 1,000. And this is why they're called quasars, quasi-stellar objects. Even with the Hubble Space Telescope, it's sometimes difficult to discern their host galaxies because the central source is so bright. But nevertheless, sometimes we can see that. There are sometimes spiral galaxy hosts, but more often they tend to be in elliptical galaxies. Also, these images often show morphology that's characteristic of galaxy mergers that we've seen earlier, tidal bridges and tails and so on. And we believe that this is not an accident, that quasar activity is fueled by galaxy encounters in a similar way as the starburst can be triggered. So here are the spectra of Seyfert 1 galaxies, and quasars are very similar to this. They have both narrow and broad emission lines. Broad emission lines tend to correspond to more standard transitions like Balmer lines of hydrogen. Narrow emission lines tend to correspond to ionized gas that is not easily observed in laboratory conditions. For example, doubly ionized oxygen lines at 5007 angstroms are very prominent, and they're almost impossible to do in the lab. And you can see that there are other common elements, neon, carbon, magnesium, and so on. Type 1 Seyfert galaxies also have bright continua. We can see right down towards the accretion disk. In the narrow line, or type 2 Seyfert galaxies, the continuum is almost invisible, but we still see emission lines. Now, it is interesting to think, like you can see emission lines from star-forming regions as well, where young stars ionize the gas. So how can we tell them apart? And the answers come from atomic physics, that you can form line ratios that correspond to low and high ionized states. For some transitions, you have to ionize gas very heavily. You need a lot of high energy photons. And sometimes stars, even the most luminous young stars, don't make photons of that energy. But yet, active nuclei do. And so in diagrams that show these kinds of line ratios, you can draw a boundary that separates those powered by star formation versus those powered by accretion into black holes. And this is how we can tell them apart. Radio galaxies were the first active nuclei that were really discovered, and from the very beginning of radio astronomy. At first, it wasn't clear what these radio sources are, but then soon enough, in the 1950s, thanks to Bade, Minkowski, and others, optical counterparts have been found for some of the more luminous radio sources. And some of them corresponded to peculiar-looking galaxies like Centaurus A and Virgo A, which is now also known as M87. Sometimes they're just some NGC elliptical galaxy. And what's shown here in color is the contours of the radio emission, or intensity image of radio emission, superposed on an optical image. And you can see that oftentimes there are two lobes and there is a host galaxy right in the middle. Now we know that this comes because the nucleus of the galaxy itself contains the central engine and has a relativistic jet that pumps these lobes. The lobes are powered by synchrotron emission, and from the measurements of their brightness and some simple physics, it was inferred very early on that they contained phenomenal amounts of energy, something like 10 to the 60 or 10 to the 61 ergs in highly ionized plasma. So the question was, what deposited that energy in the radio lobes? What's powering them? And it was understood very early on that black holes can be a viable mechanism to do that. Here is a more modern radio map of Cygnus A, one of the classical powerful radio sources, and you can see there is a point-like nucleus that does coincide with the center of the galaxy. There is a very clear jet on both sides powering the lobes, and you see instabilities as the gas that's been accelerated out of the active nucleus region encounters, say, gas in the cluster that surrounds this galaxy, so many instabilities and so on. So we can study the morphology of radio emission and learn more about physics of what goes on. There is a simple morphological classification for radio sources, and those are done by two radio astronomers called Van Arov and Riley. And type 1, their sources, tend to have prominent jets. They're brighter in the middle than to the sides. And type 2 are lobe-dominated sources, and sometimes you don't see the jet at all or the central nucleus at all. They do correspond to physically distinct states. FR1 types are probably younger radio sources. They're just beginning to pump the radio lobes. On the other hand, they can be also older, but they couldn't develop radio lobes because of their environment. BL lacs, or blazars, are a subtype of radio-loud quasars. BL lac is a name for a variable star. In fact, quasars, or other blazars, have been spotted in the 1920s, and they were given names of variable stars because nobody knew that they were a new phenomenon of nature. There's about a dozen of them that have variable star names. But BL Lacerti is the prototype, and so the whole subclass is now called blazars, which is BL lac and quasar. And sometimes you can say, well, we could have done it the other way and called them quarks, but somehow that didn't catch. Well, the spectra are dominated by strong blue continuum, and this is the continuum that's from the accretion disk and the jet itself, and it's been Doppler boosted since the jet is moving at relativistic speed towards us, and completely outshines the rest of the central engine, the broad line region, and so on. Sometimes the continuum goes down, and then you can suddenly see the usual quasar spectra. So blazars are essentially cosmic accelerators, and we are in their beam, and that makes them useful for a variety of studies that we'll mention later. They're also very variable. This is why they were confused with variable stars. Variability in their case comes from instabilities in the jet, shock waves or a jet is encountering gas around the host galaxy and so on. And they're Doppler boosted, amplified because of the relativistic motion of plasma towards us. Now, quasars in general do vary, and most of that variation is due to the changes in the accretion as the fuel is dropping down onto the black hole. That's a different type of variability. In addition to that, there is variability that's due to the relativistic jets. Some subtypes of quasars have mix of both. Usually those we call optically violent variables change by more than 10% in scope of a night or less, and can change by factors of tens depending on which frequency. Sometimes those variations are correlated between different wavelengths, say optical and radio and gamma, and sometimes they're not. These correlations or absence thereof tell us something about physics of what goes on inside these objects. Now, what we'd really like to have is a pure physical classification of active nuclei. And the things that we can think about would be the black hole mass itself, the accretion rate, which is what gives them luminosity, and the angular momentum of the black hole. These things are not directly observable, but they can be inferred from various observations. And there'll be a luminosity sequence in the space with quasars and powerful radio sources being high luminosity end, Cephers being a low luminosity end. The high luminosity sources certainly corresponding to objects with higher accretion rates and probably larger black hole masses. And there is also this distinction between radio quiet and radio loud, and this is probably where angular momentum of the black hole comes in. But more about that later. Next, we will talk about unification schemes for active nuclei that put a lot of these disparate phenomenological observations into a fairly well unified picture.